Today we're diving into what is, for all intents and purposes, a classic David versus Goliath story from British legal history. But in this story, Goliath isn't a giant, it's an actual act of parliament. This is the really strange and incredibly important case of a Mr. Pickin, a man who decided to take on the entire UK legal system.
So let me just start with a question that gets right to the heart of this whole thing. Imagine a new law is passed, one that directly affects your life, your property, but you believe it only got passed because Parliament was lied to. Should a court be able to step in, investigate, and maybe even strike that law down? That's the exact explosive question Mr. Pickin brought before the courts.
Okay, so first things first, let's meet our protagonist. This entire constitutional drama doesn't start in some grand courtroom. Nope. It begins with one man, a Mr. Pickin, and a seemingly boring piece of land right next to an old, disused railway line.
Right, so here's the deal. Mr. Pickin owned some land that was right next to an abandoned railway. Now, there was this really old law from way back in 1836 that said if the railway line was ever abandoned, the land it was on would go to the owners of the adjoining land, people just like him. But then, all of a sudden, a new Act of Parliament comes along and gives that very same land to the British Railway Board instead. Just like that, the land he was expecting to get was gone.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Mr. Pickin's claim was, well, it was explosive. He wasn't just saying the law was unfair. No, he was alleging that the British Railways Board had fraudulently misled Parliament to get that new act passed. He was accusing them of committing fraud on the highest authority in the entire country. So, Mr. Pickin's argument seems pretty powerful, right? I mean, fraud is a very serious thing. But his case was about to run smack into one of the oldest, most powerful principles of the UK Constitution, an idea that would basically turn out to be an immovable legal object. And that principle is called parliamentary sovereignty. In a nutshell, what this means is that Parliament is the boss. Period. It can make any law it wants, it can get rid of any law it wants, and, this is the crucial part, no other body, not the courts, nobody, can overrule or set aside an act of Parliament. This all comes down to a fundamental concept called the separation of powers. Just think of it like a clear division of labor. Parliament's job is to make the laws. The court's job is to interpret and apply those laws. The courts are kind of like the referees of the game, but they're not allowed to write the rule book. That's a different job entirely. And this brings us to the very specific legal barrier that stood in Mr. Pickin's way. It's something called the Enrolled Bill Rule. You can think of it as a locked door, a door that prevents the courts from peering inside Parliament's workshop to see how the sausage gets made.
So what the Enrolled Bill Rule says is this. Once a bill goes through all the steps and becomes an official law, the courts have to treat it as valid. They are not allowed to go back and investigate how it was passed, not for little mistakes, and not even for huge allegations that Parliament was lied to. There's a perfect way to think about this, the sealed document analogy. So Parliament debates and passes a bill. It gets royal assent from the monarch and is, metaphorically, sealed shut. That sealed document is then handed over to the courts, and a judge's only job is to read and apply what's written inside. They can't break the seal to question how it was put together in the first place. Now, despite these massive, massive legal hurdles, Mr. Pickin's case was so important that it went all the way to the highest court in the UK at the time, which was the House of Lords. This was it. This was the final showdown between one man's claim of a terrible injustice and a constitutional principle that had stood for centuries. Mr. Pickin's lawyers made a really simple but powerful case. They argued that there's a basic principle in law that fraud unravels everything. It's like a poison that infects anything it touches. You know, if a contract is based on fraud, a court can declare it void. So they asked, why should an act of Parliament be any different? Surely the courts have to have the power to investigate an allegation this serious. But the House of Lords, they disagreed. They ruled quite firmly that they had absolutely no power to look behind Parliament's curtain. They said that doing so would be a huge breach of the separation of powers. And think about it, it could lead to total chaos. Any law could be challenged years later based on some allegation about what was said in a debate. So for the sake of legal certainty, the rule had to stand. Mr. Pickin's case was dismissed. So Mr. Pickin lost his land, but his fight left this huge, indelible mark on UK law. Let's take a minute to look at the lasting legacy of this case and why we're still talking about it all these years later. The year was 1974,
And while this judgment didn't invent the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, it was the definitive, modern-day confirmation of its absolute power. It drew a bright, clear line in the constitutional sand that is still there today. You know, if there's one single thing to take away from this whole story, it's this. In the UK system, the courts can't save you from a bad law. The only remedy, even for a law you are convinced is based on a total lie, is a political one. You have to convince Parliament to get rid of it or to pass a new one. That's it. And that leaves us with this final, really profound question. Mr. Pickin's case powerfully confirms that Parliament is supreme, but if the courts are powerless to step in, even when faced with something as serious as alleged fraud, who actually holds Parliament accountable? Well, in the UK system, the answer to that question is the voters. And that, when you think about it, is a whole lot of responsibility.